So my name's Tara. My role at AT&T is president of the Mountain West States. And so in that role, I'm in charge of all of our external and community affairs, government affairs, and so I work in counterpart with the Vice President General Manager, who's my peer for AT&T in the Mountain West States. He's based in Denver, and he's sort of over our retail teams. And then separately, we have a network team that reports up to a different structure, and we have different sales groups for different sizes of clients and government entities, and our FirstNet teams who work with first responders and public agencies. And so we're all in different business units. And so it gets really confusing in corporate culture, like who does what and where. But you can think of me as government affairs for AT&T or the states that I cover. So I do need to say that AT&T is not responsible for anything I say. So I can say whatever I want, and I have to put this disclosure up there. So a little bit more about me and my background. So I've been with AT&T for about 8 years now, and it's been a really exciting time to be with AT&T. There's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions and divestitures and mergers again. And so our company looks very different from when I joined it 8 years ago. We acquired DirecTV, and we acquired Warner Media, which includes all sorts of media assets like CNN, HBO, and movie studios and other things like that. And then we've recently announced that we will be divesting in Warner Media and also in DirecTV. We'll spin off into a new company where we will be a 70% shareholder. So we'll still essentially control the company, but it will be its own entity. So maybe it does look exactly like when I joined 8 years ago, but it feels very different. So how I got into government affairs, and we'll go into like what that means exactly and what I do on a day-to-day basis in a bit. But my major in college was political science and economics. I graduated from Utah State in 2005, and I did a lot of internships when I was in college. I interned at Icon Health and Fitness in Logan, which is now iFit. They've rebranded, and I've heard they're about to go public. So I would love to get in on that IPO. I was a marketing intern there for a year, and then I joined the team as a marketing coordinator after I was done with like my semester-long internship, and loved working in marketing there. And it was really cool to be in the College of Business at Utah State after I finished my political science major, and then be doing the marketing major at the same time, because it really is sort of marketing, public relations, public affairs, government affairs are kind of all in the same vein. I would say in the same industry. And then also as part of my major at Utah State, I was an intern for the U.S. Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. And I worked in a little office that was part of the Secretary's office. It was called the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs. It was really cool because it was the OCIA, which was like a fun acronym, right? But funny enough, when I worked there, it was under President George Bush, and the Secretary of Labor was Elaine Chao, who you might remember was the Secretary of Transportation in the Trump administration as well. The Senate minority leader for the party. So I loved my internships. Is anyone a political science major in here? All business? You are? Oh yeah, perfect. Yes. It was for me like a super interesting major. It taught me how to read and write and persuade and be very analytical and socially minded in my business feelings. It was very different from my econ major, which was more quantitative focused, I thought. But now that I was just saying, there is now a political economy major, which I totally would have done, where you're combining like a few of the quantitative skills from your econ focus with your social and political theory and philosophy that you get with poli-sci. And so that's pretty much what I did. But I've also told students in the past that it is a totally useless major unless that's what you're in it for, right? Because it's not a major like a law degree or a medicine degree or an engineering degree where you go to school and like that is the path you're on, right? You're going to be a doctor, you're going to do this or that. And so the advice I've given to students pursuing poli-sci degrees, and I think it would also relate to business students, that you need to be open to opportunities and need to be flexible with your career and being open to different opportunities that they present themselves. Because I think eventually once I learned like what my job that I have today was and that it existed, I wanted to do that, but the way that I got there is not typical. So I've had a number of different jobs. What I didn't put on here is that I also worked at Cold Stone Creamery. I worked at a wallpaper shop. I was a substitute teacher. I mean, I've had a lot of different like odd jobs and I've worked since I was 15. So, and a golf course and at a cafe. So I've done a lot of different things and I've always been a hard worker, I feel like. But thinking about my career path, I was a legal assistant at like a litigation law firm downtown in Salt Lake. And I did that because I wanted to go to law school. And while I was working there for the year and a half that I was there, I quickly learned that most lawyers don't like being lawyers. And the type of work that I was doing at the law firm was litigation focused, meaning it was very like deadline driven. And so I was like running to the courthouse, you know, downtown in Salt Lake, barefoot at midnight to get a filing filed in person under seal. Now I feel like that type of thing is like all done electronically, but there was a time when you had to get the stamp on it before midnight and get it in the physical drop box. And that sort of deadline driven work, I think, is like very exciting for some people, but for me, it just was very stressful. And a lot of the lawyers I was with just didn't love it. And at the time I was dating someone and then married someone who was going to law school. And so I thought one lawyer in the family was enough. But what working at the law firm made me realize is the type of person that I am is I wanted to network. I thought by seeing my path, my career path, including law school, that I needed to network and I needed to get to know lawyers so I could get a really good job in the legal field. But that told me more about myself than it did about me wanting to be a lawyer, right? I was the type of person that was always networking and trying to be social. And so I decided to pivot at that point and was looking for a job sort of in the public policy arena. And when I was at the law firm, we worked on a really interesting case. It was a patent dispute between Linux and Unix, the operating systems, if you remember that. And the SCO group was the client we represented. It's in Utah County. And I don't think they're still around today, but you know, it kind of was like one of the early companies that was out there like leading out with Silicon Slopes. So this whole like technology policy area was something I didn't know existed and I thought was super interesting. And so I started applying with tech and communications companies with any government related jobs and ended up working at Comcast in Washington, DC on their policy team as an assistant. So I started with like very administrative driven tasks, booking travel, doing expenses. And then like, once I kind of proved myself, they were like, we need you to go to congressional hearings and take notes. And then I started writing memos and saying, is this helpful? And they're like, well, that is helpful. And we should share this with our business units. So that became my responsibility, was going to any congressional hearing that affected Comcast's business, and then writing memos and sending those out to our impacted business units. And then also preparing any of our executives that were called on to testify before Congress. And it was a really exciting time to be there because that's when they acquired NBC Universal, and there were a number of congressional hearings on that merger and acquisition. And so it was like one of those like, you know, things I was trying to get away from in the legal field where we were like working all night, whatever. But I have found with any job where you have you're a meaningful part of the team and there are any sort of deadlines, that's going to happen, right? And being willing to show up and to put in the hours, especially when you're early on in your career, is something that will get noticed. I never said no to anything at Comcast. I filled seats at tables. I did table days, at marketing events. I would, make calls. I did everything that they needed, even though it wasn't like in my tidy little job description. And I had a really good experience there. I worked really hard. I was probably really underpaid. They probably got a great deal out of having me work there. But it also got me my next job, which was running a program for the state of Utah with the previous round of stimulus funding back in 2008. And I started up the broadband mapping and planning office in the governor's office of economic development. So I got to take the policy that I had learned about in Washington, my previous job, and then apply that at the state level, working directly with broadband providers like Comcast and AT&T and county economic development officials, cities that were saying they didn't have internet access. We worked with universities, we worked with the Utah Education and Telehealth Network, UDOT, a bunch of state agency partners to kind of look at where broadband was available and then also where it wasn't, try to figure out why it wasn't available in some places, what the barriers to deployment or to access for businesses and for residential customers was. So while I was at that job, AT&T actually came to meet with me about a previous merger they had with T-Mobile to try to get the state to support it. And that's where I met my now boss, who actually lives in Logan, and he's like our regional president. But he recruited me to come to AT&T a while later, and so I've been at AT&T ever since. And also, I should mention that as part of my job at AT&T too, they really want me to be out there and be visible with the community and make sure that our company is investing in things that are important to the communities where we provide service and have employees. So I'm on a few different boards and commissions as well. And the last one on that list, the Utah Division of Alcoholic Beverage Control, I was appointed by Governor Cox to be a commissioner about 6 or 7 months ago, and that has nothing to do with my work at AT&T. That's just totally separate, and I had to get that approved by AT&T to be a DABC commissioner. That's been a whole new and exciting experience.
That while you're at AT&T?
Yeah, it is like an unpaid job. What we do on the commission is approve bar licenses, restaurant licenses, and deal with different implications of alcohol policy. So the legislature sets the policy, and then it's the commission's job to carry out the policy that the legislature sets. So I've learned that as a DABC commissioner in Utah, you get a lot of complaints from people about like, why can't I get wine, delivered to my house, and why can't I do X, Y, or Z? And I'm like, I would love for you to be able to do these things that you're asking me to help you with, but that is your legislature. So go talk to them.
It's kind of crazy that they got rid of the lower point alcohol percentage beers and then also lowered the alcohol,
Yeah,
for driving or whatnot.
the blood alcohol.
Yeah,
level.
alcohol.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the lower point beer, Utah was like an outlier where we would have been the last state in the country with like that low point beer. So the national retailers were like, we're not gonna make Utah beer anymore.
Right.
So yeah, so that's an interesting point. I didn't think about it, but that happened at the same time.
Yeah.
What's that?
That's just so not like.
Oh yeah, interesting. So actually, one of my good friends who I used to work with at the governor's office of economic development, she was a commissioner, and she just got appointed to be the governor's budget director. So, I was congratulating her. And I've always been interested in alcohol policy because it's as a policy nerd, like alcohol policy is like as interesting as it gets. It's Utah is like a control state. There are only 17 control states. And when you think about public policy and political theory, the way that alcohol is regulated in the state is kind of also like an interesting economic experiment because it's a state-controlled market, but not everything is controlled by the state. And so it's always been interesting to me. I've always talked to her about what they do in the commission. And I said, what are they going to do with your commission seat? And she said, honestly, I haven't had time to think about it, but I think you should apply. And I was like, I'm not qualified. You know, I've got a job. And she was like, actually, I think you're very well qualified for this. I'd like to recommend you. We talked to my boss and we talked to my husband, and then the next day I had an interview with the governor's office. And then it took about 4 months for me to actually have a Senate hearing and confirmation. And for the nomination to be official and public and all of that. So it was kind of interesting how that all happened. But one lesson that I took out of that is I was kind of disappointed that like my gut reaction to saying you should apply was that I wasn't qualified. And so, you know, I don't know why I think that. If you look at the other commissioners, like just as qualified, and you know, because it takes someone to be involved in public policy a little bit to understand what the commission's duty is, what they do and what they don't do, right? What the legislature does and what the DABC does. A little bit of administrative law, at least understanding how that works. And so, yeah, so I was qualified. I can't believe it took me a while to come around to that, but have faith in yourself, I guess. So what my job is at AT&T in government affairs, I'm sure you've all heard the term government affairs, but it's just a different way of saying lobbyist. So I am a lobbyist, but you know, it's like a dirty term that like people don't want to own or whatever. And I will say that's not how I picture it. And I've never really seen lobbying that way. I think it gets a bad rap because there are bad actors out there, right? And you hear about, you know, tit for tat or, you know, favors for bills being passed or whatever. And I'm not going to say that stuff doesn't happen, but I think what a lot of people don't realize is like work in government affairs is very dependent on your ability to be trusted with information, your reputation, and for me, my company's reputation. Everything I do is based on the AT&T brand and you know how we're viewed and the policies that we have. So I'll just pause right there and see if there are any questions before we kind of talk about the different aspects of government and external affairs. Okay, if anything comes up, just interrupt me. So I find that I have a hard time explaining exactly what I do. So I found a nice little PBS video that we can watch to talk about what lobbying is, which I think is helpful, especially if you've never worked in government or okay, yeah, let's.
When you're standing on the front steps of the Capitol, you can see the confluence of two rivers. One is public sentiment, the other is political reality. And right here, a vortex of frustration and distrust. Notice the well-dressed creatures splashing around in the middle. Those are lobbyists. The word sounds ominous, doesn't it? Lobbyists. On the surface, these people are almost exactly what you think they are. They schmooze, they educate, they cut deals, and collectively they have a tremendous impact on our legislative agenda. But that doesn't answer the real question. Are they evil? The answer really depends on your perspective. Here's what we know. They're definitely active. On any given day, you can find them taking meetings, cornering lawmakers, and generally shepherding legislation through the plumbing of the Capitol. But to be fair, judgments of good and evil don't really apply here. This is simply work. The bigger question is whether they should be doing this stuff at all. So let's try it this way. What would happen if lobbyists disappeared? Luckily, cartoon segments lend themselves to this type of speculation. Poof! Welcome to a world without lobbyists. You may not believe it, but we just lost a tremendous amount of legislative expertise. It often takes decades to learn how the Capitol really works, and now that we've removed what are essentially civic leaders, business people, and former lawmakers, there are a lot less advocates in this building bridging the gap between public needs and partisan polarization. As a result, our government is now almost entirely driven by the limited knowledge of our elected officials. And that's not a shot at the politicians. It's simply an acknowledgement of just how big this job really is. Even in the ego-saturated halls of the Capitol, people value expertise. And when a representative needs to know what the law enforcement community thinks about recent LGA initiatives in South Minneapolis, lobbyists are the fastest route to some answers. And here's the key. The answers had better be honest. If a lawmaker gets burned by some false or misleading research, you can bet the lobbyist that gave it to him is going to taste the bubblegum on the front steps. Ideally, lobbyists serve as the voice boxes for larger forces, and what we think about them probably depends more on the issues they represent than the actual existence of the profession. And that brings us back to the front steps of the Capitol and the confusing nature of politics. On this side, nobody likes influence peddlers. But on this side, there are some very human lawmakers who are tackling a job that's way too big for just themselves. If you want to experience this mashup personally, feel free to come down to the Capitol. Just be sure to wear a life jacket, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. That's all the time we have this week. Let us know what doesn't make sense, and we'll do our best to figure out how it happens.
So, on behalf of AT&T, a lot of what I do regarding my duties as a lobbyist are reviewing legislation or city ordinances that are introduced by like a lawmaking body. So let's use the state of Utah and the state legislature, for example. So they might introduce a bill, and this bill, let me think of one that I worked on. Let's use an example of 911. Everybody supports 911. There's a fee on your phone bill for 911. But I've dealt with this issue for a number of years in a number of different contexts and bills. But let's say that the state wants to increase the 911 fee to pay for X, Y, and Z. And there's a legislator who's like, oh yeah, the 911 fee would be a great way to pay for, I don't know, let's just say for police officer salaries, right? Because we need police officers to respond to 911 calls. And so they introduce a bill to increase the 911 fee, and the proceeds from that fee or tax would actually pay for 911 officer salary. Well, I see that bill, and I review hundreds of bills in the state of Utah every year separately. Much less legislation in Idaho and Montana, just the differences in our states and the way they work. But I'll review the bill. This will get flagged for me by like an automated service that we use. You know, it has a keyword of 911 in it. So I read it and I'm like, oh, wow, the state can't use 911 fees for police officer salaries. Like, they should know that. This is going to get challenged in court, or they're going to get a fine from the FCC for misuse of 911 fees. So I go to the legislator who's introduced the bill and say, hey, Senator Bramble, did you know that this fee increase being used to pay for police officer salaries is not lawful? Like, 911 fees cannot be used in that way. Well, I didn't know that, and who's going to tell me no? And, you know, we need this money for police officer salaries. And I'm like, well, here's an example in X, Y, and Z state where they've tried to do the same thing and they were sued by the FCC, or they were cited for misuse of public funding because federal legislation says the 911 fee can only be allowed for these purposes: call taking and dispatch and equipment. Oh, well, I didn't know that. Thank you for letting me know. How about we change the bill in a different way so we get the police officer salary money from the general fund or from something else instead of from the 911 fee? Yes, thank you. And we'd love to support your bill. That's like a typical thing that happens with like at least 10 bills every single year, where a legislator has a really good intentions with, you know, a path that they see forward to a problem that they're trying to solve, but they might not have all the facts. I mean, the point is our legislators are part-time in their legislative duties. So we have a 45-day session every year, and then we have a number of interim meetings throughout the year. And actually, our legislature was just meeting today and yesterday. And they'll have a number of interim meetings where committees are discussing different bills and issues to take up during the legislative session. But almost all of the legislators have different jobs. Some are attorneys, some are ranchers, some are doctors, some are teachers. I mean, some don't work. Some are wealthy, some are not wealthy. But I mean, it runs the gambit. And so they are not expert in telecom or 911 fees or broadband. And so lobbyists and other groups, you know, like lobbyist associations or interest groups are helpful in that way to let legislators know about unintended consequences, or maybe even pushing them in the right direction. One of the biggest bills I've ever worked on was small cell legislation. People know what a small cell is, or have seen maybe those poles going up in downtown Salt Lake and different cities. Basically what a small cell is, it's like a light pole. Like, look outside and you see these light poles, but what we're trying to do is install antennas that are lower powered but deliver higher throughput, and so they need to be closer to where people are using them. So that's what we call a small cell, or a small antenna, small wireless facility, is what the law calls it. So to be able to do that in a uniform way, because our network doesn't have, you know, a boundary that stops at a city or a county, we really wanted cities to be able to have similar rules of the road for considering applications for small cells and allowing wireless providers to deploy small cells to help us transition to 5G. And so we worked with a senator, had him review and help us draft legislation. Well, he drafted it with the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel that would allow for cities to be reviewing these applications in the same way. As it turns out, cities have found ways to get around the law in ways that I never dreamed of in 2018. I'm not sure how useful the law actually was, but it took a lot of work to get people to support the bill. We negotiated with the League of Cities and Towns, the Rocky Mountain Power, with rural cooperative providers, rural electrical providers. A lot of people came to the table that you would not think would care about this, but the lawmaking process is really collaborative, and it's my job to know who cares about what and who should be involved in what discussion, to make sure they're coming to the table and that we're sharing information and moving forward. So that's another big part of lobbying. That's what I do in 3 states from about January to April every year. So it's like super exciting, super fast paced. And I also work with contract lobbyists. So I only represent AT&T. I only care about AT&T interests, but we also have contract lobbyists who will have, like, you know, 20 to 50 clients that are also different companies or associations or cities or universities who work directly with legislators, just like I do, but for a number of different clients. So another part of what I do that's kind of intertwined with lobbying is public policy. So I also have to understand how laws are made, how they're implemented, and how legislation that's proposed might change things. So AT&T will say our public policy priorities for this year were racial justice. So I got a whole new, you know, I had to learn a lot about racial injustice in the past and how different states handled different, you know, bills that are totally outside of my normal world, which is like taxes and broadband. And so, you know, police reform was a big part of that, and really looking at how, as a company, we can help the needle on those types of bills. We've also had a priority of monitoring and participating in state broadband funding. So that's been a lot of work as well. And so our company will come up with different policy priorities from time to time. And so it's my job to understand how those big picture items that the company wants done will be interpreted and how I can help move the needle within, my space and in the policymaking process.
It's interesting that you work for AT&T, but you're working on stuff for the police department, like legislature. For the
Yeah,
department.
police reform. So that was, that priority for our company really came out of, all the turmoil that's been going on, especially after the murder of George Floyd. And I think a lot of different companies, were asked to like step up and make a difference. And AT&T has a long history of supporting racial equality. I mean,
Right,
we're such an old company.
How does AT&T like go, like, were they just like raising their hand in the middle of a big room saying, hey, we want to be part of this, or like?
I guess if you think about it metaphorically, maybe, yeah. But we also, put our money where our mouth is. We made a lot of contributions and partnerships with large organizations that have been at the forefront of the fight, the NAACP and others. And so at a state level where I am, that's a big macro policy, and we've gotten out and like tried to make it known that we support police reform and whatnot. So for companies to get engaged in that way, it might not seem natural, but more and more companies are being expected to have an opinion on sort of like social issues. And so where it's been ingrained in our history, I think it was natural for like our executive leadership and board to really say, we need to do something here. And so then I take it way down to my level and where I am dealing with state legislatures. And so if there are bills supporting police reform, we have lawyers and public policy experts that I work with that will help me review the legislation. And if we can help support efforts where it's appropriate, we'll work with the bill sponsor to say, we support this, how can we help? Or to work with the Salt Lake Chamber or other groups that we work with to say, this is a good bill, we should support this. So it's hard to see like a straight line between why AT&T would care about this, but I think it has a lot to do with our reputation and the way that we want to be perceived in the community, and honestly, like our corporate responsibility to speak up when we see something happening. Yeah.
So I'm just kind of question. Yeah. So you give me maybe an example, something like a bill you help with that. So I don't understand if you're doing stuff like the 911 call where you're obviously
That's clear.
tied, yeah. Is it the one you have a connection to, or is it more like a, hey, we want to help, so we're just going to send funds and research that way, like you?
I mean, I think it's a combination, and sometimes that's all we can do is, support organizations who are in the middle of sort of those opportunities. I think about another one, maybe this will help draw the line a little closer. So when you think about corporate social responsibility in general, which is also part of my job in external affairs, I think about like disaster response, disaster recovery. So clearly when there's a hurricane and your cell phone doesn't work, you want AT&T to do their job and make your cell phone work, right? So where we've like helped support the Red Cross and other agencies that like assist in those efforts, that's kind of a straighter line, right? Where we support nonprofits that kind of help with the mission. But to reverse it, I think there's been a trend today of companies supporting where there isn't the bright line of like, this doesn't do anything to help my bottom line. It doesn't help me keep customers. It doesn't help me retain customers, but it does help me position our brand in a way that is important and meaningful. And I think more and more companies are being expected to participate in social causes. So it's almost like if we don't do something and other companies do something, are we going to look like we don't care? Because we do care. And so it's not a clear line, and it's not like, it doesn't give us an exact ROI. Like if we invest this much, we're going to get this much out of our business. And I think in past, that's kind of how doing business worked. And today, it's more than that. It's like a cloud of like, marketing and brand perception, and it all has to like weave together. And my small role is just one part of like that bigger picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not like a nice, clean answer, but it's an evolving space. And there's like a whole line of work and study on corporate social responsibility and whether or not that leads to like a return on investment or not. I mean, you saw my picture probably with Dan Reynolds from Imagine Dragons. I met him, I got to meet him and take a picture with him. That's all it was. Like, hi, thanks, bye. At the Love Loud Music Festival that was at USANA in 2019. And AT&T is like the lead supporter of the Love Loud Music Festival. So it's the Love Loud Music Festival presented by AT&T. And I was super proud to see the company step up and support like the LGBTQ community here in Utah. And the Love Loud Music Festival attracts people from all over the West, and they had some really big names. So it's cool to see that. But that sponsorship, I can only imagine how much it costs to like have AT&T associated with that. And so that probably gives us like a brand perception, the LGBT community, that we care and we're doing something, which is kind of like cause marketing, right? And so, is it altruistic for companies to be involved in something like that? I don't know, but is it good for the community? Is it good for causes that are important to communities? I think so. So also I am involved politically as part of my job. So I do campaign contributions on behalf of the company. So I come up with a budget. I support candidates on behalf of the company from the AT&T corporate political funds. And we also have employee PACs in many states and federally, not in my states. But that's where our employees contribute to a political action committee. And the political action committee can donate funds to candidates. And those candidates might be people that support causes that we care about. They might be have business priorities like at the legislature that we agree with philosophically. Might be people in leadership that have power. That's important too. Political giving strategies will vary for every company and individual, but that's also part of my job.
Does AT&T discriminate between the people that they choose? Because you said that they help people that are running. Are they discriminative towards the Republicans or the Democrats, or is it just they choose who they think is best going to fit wherever they're trying to go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say it's not about discriminating against parties. It's usually issues and platforms and being business friendly or not that is a bigger determinant of if we're going to donate politically to someone or not. But that said, it is the political reality that Republicans control all three legislatures and now hold all three governors' positions in all three of my states, and they have super majorities in all three states. So there are just more people that are Republicans. So that will usually sway my budget more Republican than Democrat, but I give to both. And actually, I'm pretty sure at the federal level, we give equally. So, yeah, no, we do not discriminate based on party, but it's also part of what you have to consider when you're doing political contributions. Okay, we kind of talked about corporate social responsibility, but are there any other questions I can answer, or even like what I do, or if not, I'll tell you a funny story. Yeah.
I do have a question about corporate social responsibility. Do you think that there's more pressure on the larger corporations than there are on small businesses?
Yes.
To have that. So how do you see small businesses do that compared to the larger corporations?
I love that you asked that, because I was just on a panel at Silicon Slopes last week about corporate social responsibility or corporate give back programs. And so I was a big company. There was someone from Qualtrics on the panel. and a consultant, I call her. She's kind of a small business consultant, but she focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion for small businesses. And then someone who was a super small business, but he was also in the Real Housewives. So I think that for big businesses, it's a part of our framework. We have like a chief sustainability officer, and she focuses exclusively on corporate social responsibility. We have a whole business unit that's part of our external affairs group. Or, you know, I talked about different business silos at the beginning, but this is all she does is focus on like how we're giving back to the community and how that lines up with our corporate priorities and objectives. So like it's ingrained in what we do. And maybe people thought of it differently or just thought of it as charitable giving in the past, but now every big business has a whole department that does just this. But for small businesses, what I said on the panel last week too is that, you know, you might not have a give back strategy immediately and you might not need one, but I think if you expect to keep recruiting and retaining employees, it's so important to be involved in causes that they care about. So I think, especially when you're a small business, a way to set yourself apart is to have, you know, causes that employees can get involved in or see you getting involved in. My sister is the lead buyer for Ruli in Logan. It's like an online clothing I almost said retailer. And so as part of their give back program, I mean, I think they have up to 200 employees now, but since they started, their CEO has been all about empowering women. And so they have found a number of charities that are about empowering women or women in business or childcare needs or women's issues in general. And so they've had like competitions between their employee groups to like, you know, add up volunteer hours for like their specific cause, and then the company will donate on their behalf. And so they make it part of the whole culture of work. And so I think that that's more the trend. And I think that's not going away, even at like the smallest level. And if you're a company who wants to do business with bigger companies, they are also now expecting that you're involved in community or social causes or have some level of give back program that's part of your corporate strategy. So that's a good question because I've never worked. I mean, I guess I've worked for a small business before, but I think it's going to be different for everyone, right? I don't think there's like a revenue amount. Like once we reach $1 million in revenue, we're going to start giving back. I think it depends on your business too. Maybe you're a tech consulting firm and you've reached a point where you're like seeking bigger clients and they're looking at you saying, what's your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy? Or how do you work with communities? And all of a sudden you've got to start thinking about that. Maybe that's how you deal with it, right? Is because of your business needs and other people asking that. But I think for most businesses, what I've seen is that they reach a tipping point where it's their employees saying like, hey, I care a lot about the Make-A-Wish Foundation in Utah. We put together an employee group and go do volunteer efforts. And it usually starts pretty organically from what I've seen. It's less focused on like a request or a demand, but it's more about like employee engagement.
I was going to ask, I wasn't expecting that. I assumed it would be kind of a quick and that started from like tax.
Oh, well, don't get me wrong, like that's a big one too. I think it used to be a bigger deal to have tax exempt donations. But that tax write-offs, I feel like they're not as impactful as one would think, especially at like a business scale, an enterprise scale. But that's part of it too. That's a good one. I should have said that on my panel last week. Don't forget about the tax write-off. Yeah. Other questions? Any causes you guys care about or issues you've heard about at the legislature? big, big dust up and it's not done.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up Silicon Slopes. I was gonna ask you about that with your early days being in the tech industry and now with Silicon Slopes being what it is. I was gonna see what you thought about Silicon Slopes forming a pack.
Yeah, I think that it's really smart that they're forming a pack. I heard at Silicon Slopes last week that the tech industry in Utah makes up 50% of the GDP of the state. That's huge. That's a lot of, that's a lot of power, but they haven't really translated that to political power because things that Silicon Slopes and different tech companies have asked for haven't really happened. And I'm not sure that they have the best reputation, but they're working to try to improve that. So by forming a PAC, they can start supporting candidates. They can start recruiting and helping candidates get trained up and run for office. So I think that'll be a big deal. And I think they're going to make some big waves and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think it was very